Colleagues, thank you for the invitation to be part of this annual colloquium on open learning, flexible and blended learning, and teaching approaches in post-school education and training. My topic today is research in open learning, lessons for a post-COVID world, which I have prepared jointly with my colleague, Dr. Sanjaya Mishra, who leads our work in technology-enabled learning. But first, a word about the Commonwealth of Learning. COL, as you know, is an intergovernmental organization with headquarters in Canada. Our mission is to help Commonwealth member states and institutions to use distance learning and technologies for expanding access to education and training. South Africa is an important member of the Commonwealth of Learning, and we are very grateful for your consistent financial and intellectual support. In this presentation, I will begin by highlighting the impact that COVID-19 has had on higher education. I will then reflect on open learning and what it means today in the context of remote emergency education. This will lead into what research tells us about the different dimensions of open learning and the implications for a post-pandemic future. Finally, I will conclude with the lessons learned and identify the way forward in a post-COVID world. COVID-19 has had an unprecedented impact on education and training at all levels. The biggest disruption has been the closure of campuses, where more than 220 million higher education students worldwide were affected. Most institutions had to pivot to emergency remote teaching. Many did not have adequate technology infrastructure. The mobility of international students plummeted, with countries losing large revenues from student fees. Budget cuts were imposed by governments, and research suffered, especially that reliant on practical work and external collaborations. So how did the teachers respond? A survey conducted in Europe found that most teachers live-streamed lectures synchronously. A large number of teachers also used asynchronous approaches by sending pre-recorded videos and audio lectures. The same survey found that students suffered from heavy workloads, and half of them felt that their performance had declined. Many faced challenges relating to technology tools and connectivity, and most felt an impact on their psychological well-being. Now, during the pandemic, most institutions found the greatest challenge related to digital infrastructure, which included lack of access to devices, connectivity, even electricity. Teachers were not prepared for the sudden transition to online learning, and existing inequalities were further exacerbated. In a survey conducted at Stanford University, which is one of the richest universities in the world, 16% of the undergraduate students did not have access to the internet for half the time, and 60% of students from low-income homes did not have a private space for study. The situation wasn't much different in South Africa, where 35% students in Nelson Mandela University did not have digital access. Students in KwaZulu-Natal also indicated a lack of digital skills, and 24% of the students at the University of Pretoria had to pay for access to learning materials during the pandemic. Over 63 million teachers were impacted by this pandemic, and data from the rich OECD countries indicates that only 60% teachers had some training in ICTs. A study in the US and Canada revealed that over 50% of the teachers required help with supporting remote students. They needed access to digital materials and wanted assistance with technology use. As we know, the vulnerable are most impacted in crisis situations. It is estimated that the number of school dropouts and college dropouts will increase, with 11 million girls not likely to return. The pandemic has deepened the existing learning crisis. A study in the Netherlands records a learning loss of about 3 percentile points, with higher losses among students from less educated homes. So how will these inequalities and learning losses be mitigated? Can open learning be the answer? Open learning describes policies and practices that permit entry to learning with as few barriers as possible. The founding Chancellor of the Open University UK, Lord Crowther, defined openness in relation to people, places, methods, and ideas. This is the philosophical basis of open education. But how open are we in practice? We are actually, because many open universities do not insist on entry qualifications, allow learners to accumulate credits at their own pace and convenience, and are flexible enough to allow learners to choose courses they wish to study towards their qualification. Open in terms of access, types of curriculum, participation, and accreditation is quite different from emergency remote learning. As we know, distance education is the separation of teacher and learner, which is mediated by some kind of technology. This happened during this pandemic. But distance education also requires a great deal of systematic planning, which was not possible because of the urgency of the situation. In distance education, an educational institution designs and develops the learning materials and provides ongoing learner support. In open and distance learning, synchronous education is not the only option. We can choose to learn asynchronously at any time and at any place of our choice. It also points in the direction of competency-based learning, where duration becomes insignificant and what counts is the outcomes achieved rather than the hours put in. Distance learning allows the option to mix institutional and workplace-based learning to suit individual needs. Recognition of prior learning allows for multiple learning pathways, so it is quite flexible. And open and distance learning has developed over the years. Professor Taylor's 5 generations of distance learning models sums up the evolution from correspondence education to multimedia to online provision. All phases have been witnessed in South Africa. ODL institutions have typically adopted a blended approach, which combines both distance and in-person provision. Now, during the pandemic, all institutions had to use technology. We have seen different responses. For advocates of open and distance learning, the silver lining has been the global acceptance of distance and online learning. A recent study in the UK found that the majority of university students rated the quality of online learning as excellent, and this was also the case in China. On the other hand, at the University of British Columbia, over 60% students did not think that the emergency remote teaching was as effective as in-person provision. Now, traditionally, open and distance learning institutions have provided increased access and equity. In 2020, over 11% of all higher education students in India were studying at a distance, with over 44% of them being female. In South Africa in 2019, over 34% students were enrolled in distance education, with 68% of them being female. But then when we compare these numbers to the phenomenal increase in MOOC enrollments, we can see that the scale that can be achieved through technology is even higher than what traditional ODL has so far aspired to achieve. Open universities do achieve scale as compared to campus institutions, which drives down the costs per university graduate to less than half of what their campus counterparts pay, as a comparative study of mega universities shows. Another study found that while face-to-face costs per participant were $6.7, the same training was offered online at half the costs with comparable outcomes. During the pandemic, teachers needed access to quality digital content. There has been an increase in the use of open educational resources, or OER. A COL study in Antigua and Barbuda found that using OER textbooks reduced the costs for students and at the same time improved learning outcomes. Researchers at Concordia University carried out a meta-analysis of several studies to find out what kind of interaction led to the best results. They looked at student-text, student-student, and student-teacher interactions. Interestingly, the student-content interaction was the most effective, further strengthening the case for the use of quality OER. Research shows that there is no significant difference between distance and traditional classroom instruction in terms of learning outcomes. Yet there is a lingering perception that distance education is not as effective as class-based education. In fact, some research shows that students in blended learning performed marginally better than those in the classroom. And about 15% of the world's population suffers from some form of disability. Yet in some developing countries, less than 1% of persons with disabilities have access to higher education. Research also indicates that persons with disabilities prefer distance learning because it's convenient, as they can study at their own pace, place, and time. Distance learning offers content in various formats so learners can read, listen, or watch lectures. Distance learning is more affordable and offers a degree of anonymity where students with disabilities can interact with professors and peers without feeling discriminated. Now, in addition to the pandemic, we have recently seen vast disruptions due to climate-related disasters. The education sector contributes to both direct and indirect emissions with an impact on environmental degradation. So how can we reduce the carbon footprint of education? Following research by the Open University UK, COL conducted a similar study in Botswana, which found that the average carbon footprint of the campus learner is nearly 3 times greater than that of the distance learner. Emissions from travel were by far the greatest contributor to this disparity. This is one area which needs further research. And if we review research trends since 2014, we find that the focus has mainly been on the expanding remit of open education, the role of educational technologies, and the quality of online learning. So how can we mainstream ODL in a post-pandemic world? Finally, let us look at 5 issues that emerged during the pandemic and how we can learn from these to transform higher education. First, we have seen that purely online options do not work for everyone. The future will be a blend of online and in-person approaches, using a range of technologies that are affordable, accessible, and available. This will require systematic planning and implementation with continuous monitoring and evaluation. Second, as the pandemic forces governments to cut back on resource allocations, we will need to look for cost-effective solutions. Mainstreaming OER by building the capacities of teachers and policymakers, and preparing learners on how to find, use, and share OER could be the way forward for affordable higher education. Third, we have seen a huge rise in self-directed learning during the pandemic, as we can see from the phenomenal increases in MOOC enrollments. We can build on these foundations to promote lifelong learning for all. Fourth, formal assessments and proctoring systems suffered major setbacks during the pandemic, where institutions adopted innovative approaches to build flexible models and make assessments more authentic. For example, UNISA developed app-based assessments. Griffith University in Australia used oral assessments for the business program, and India introduced open book exams at scale. Fifth, in order to address the growing inequalities, governments and institutions need to develop policies that address the needs of the last person in the queue. And these are usually women, girls, those in remote regions, and persons with disabilities. The policies that target the margins are also effective in serving those at the center. So how can we strengthen higher education going forward? Government policies and funding will be critical for research and extension. Technology infrastructure and connectivity will be key in providing education that is affordable and accessible. Universities need to align more closely with the needs of their societies and promote research that leads to sustainable development. So on that note, let me thank you for your kind attention. Be safe, be cheerful.